about yet is finding your required minimum sample size for proportions. So don't write anything yet. What is my equation when I'm dealing with means end up being? And that whole part is, and I derived this equation by doing a couple steps in algebra, starting with what? And margin of error equals times what here? Over. And then we just went through algebra steps to get here, right? So we're going to do the same process today. So today, when we're dealing with proportions, our margin of error section starts with what? Still Z. What does this change to be? So it's going to change a little bit because we've got, here we had just square root on, or just sigma on top. Now I've got p hat times 1 minus p hat. And it was just the square root on the bottom. Now it's also the square root on the top. So things are going to change a little bit. You might want to write some of this with me. I know you don't have much space. Like I'm going to end up writing the rearranged equation. But you might want to at least write that we're starting with this before you get to the rearranged equation. So algebra there, what's my next step? What am I solving? What am I trying to isolate? N. So what's my first thing to do? Divide by Z. So right now I have margin of error divided by Z equals everything under the square root. My step after that is to do what? What do I want to get rid of? So how do I get rid of square root? So right now I have margin of error divided by Z, that whole thing squared, equals p hat, 1 minus p hat, over n. And I know I didn't leave you much of any room to do the algebra steps. What's my next step? Multiply both sides by n. And my last step is just to do what? Divide by this whole part right here. So we end up getting that. So what you definitely have to write is our lowercase n needs to be greater than or equal to p hat times 1 minus p hat divided by margin of error over our z, just that section squared. And just like before, that's not something you have to memorize. We just did a couple steps of algebra to get there. Some of you are going to memorize it on accident, just because you do it a couple times, you'll remember what it is. Some people are going to rather memorize it because they don't want to mess up the algebra. And then some people are just going to do the algebra on the test. Either one is fine. All right, so that actually is our equation that we're going to be using. Now you do not need to write anything here. At part of this equation, I'm going to be multiplying p hat times 1 minus p hat, correct? Alright, so let's say I just pick a percent to deal with. Let's say I want p hat to be 10%. What is 10% as a decimal? Which means 1 minus p hat would be what? Wait, what do you do? I'm just talking about the fact that we're going to have to do this. So I'm just going to make up one real quick. I'm starting, if my p hat were 10%, my 1 minus p hat would be 90%. And p hat times 1 minus p hat in that example would give me what? What? 0.09, right? Is that a very big number? Alright, so we're going to figure out where in our combination of these is going to give me a big number. So 10% isn't very much. So what's something else I could use here?
Where are you getting 0.09 from?
That times that. Alright, let me skip in pieces here. What if I do 0.30? What would this be? What would this be? It got bigger, yes? If I go all the way up to 70, what's it going to be? 0.21, because that would be 70 times 30 instead of 30 times 70. So, when I get here, what do I get?
0.25.
If I keep going from there, what's 0.6 times 0.2, or what's 0.6 times 0.4? So what is the biggest product of all combinations of p's and p hats I could have? P hats and 1 minus p hats I could have. That's the highest product of any values of p hat and 1 minus p hat I could have. Everybody good with that? So, in most examples, if I'm trying to figure out how many I have to sample to see what my margin of error would be, I'm seeing how many people I need to sample. So am I going to have a p hat before I sample anybody? Does that make sense? I'm not going to have a p hat because p hat comes from a sample, but I've got to figure out how many people to sample. So we go conservative. We go conservative by saying, well, what is the biggest number I would possibly get if my p hat were 0.5, which means my 1 minus p hat would be 0.5. Because anything other than that would give me a smaller number, mean I need less. Vaguely with me. This is the highest possible combination of product I could get. So, if I have no idea what my p hat is, I'm going to pretend like it's the biggest. So, worst case scenario, I'm interviewing too many people. So, that's where it says right here, you can either use P based on a pilot study, which means like a couple years ago we did a study and this is what it was. Sometimes it'll give you that. If one is not given, we use P equals 0.5 because of the reason I just went through. Because that is the most conservative, that would give me the highest product, which would tell me the highest possible sample size I would need.
We're using P equals 0.5 or P hat?
P hat. Because the margin of error is highest when your P or P hat is 0.5. You have to write hats on this if you want to. It applies to other chapters too. So, these two people are candidates for mayor in a large city race. You're planning a sample survey to determine what % of voters plan to vote for the one person. You'll contact a random sample of registered voters in the city. You want to estimate P. You want to be 95% confidence. And a margin of error no greater than 4%. And this is telling me I'm not doing a 4-step, I'm solving for n. So we just did all of the algebra to get to our answer for what this would look like. So I am using that lowercase n has to be greater than or equal to what with symbols? hat times 1 minus p hat. What from there? And just that section is squared. So let's plug in our numbers. What am I going to use as p hat here? 0.5, because it didn't give me one, so 0.5 times 0.5 is the most conservative. What is my margin of error? How do I write that? 0.04. How do I find my z?
The blue sheet, 95.
So 95% for a z is what?
1.560.
And I want everybody to type that in because some people aren't going to type this right at first. If you need a calculator and you haven't got one yet, get one. And you should, if you're typing this in correctly, get 600 point something.
Yes.
Which means my answer is actually what?
601.
But I always have people who end up typing this in wrong because of parentheses stuff. So either grab somebody else's calculator if you did it wrong and see what how yours looks different than theirs, or ask them or ask me, or what we need to at some point to get this figured out. And then once you're done with that, go ahead and do the next problem, A and B. Yeah. Okay, so I think it's this. Oh, you just forgot your zero. You typed everything in right. It was just 0.04 instead. Yeah, that was all you did. Does anybody else need me to look at calculator with typing this in?
Can you use the P as the P? Or no?
So this is saying
I used the 0.44.
this is terrible. I should have said something about national previous. I should say something like that.
So we can use.
Yeah, I want you using this. I just didn't word it very well.
I got 18 seconds.
So we use that as a mini pad.
Yeah.
What did you?
I'm not trying to confuse you there, but if we're trying to find P, I'm not giving you P. So like that, you shouldn't confuse yourself with that part, no problem. And what do you end up getting as your answer for A?
1,000.
Before I ever even do B, which most of you are done, if this one used a p hat, any value of p hat, and part B is going to use 0.5 instead, I know before I do anything that my answer to B is going to be what? Bigger than that. Because more conservative, it's saying sample more people.
So you should take off the, P16.
So like your bottom one, like you do something we've done before. We're gonna get 2.5, so
Yeah.
it's gonna be, this one works exactly.
Oh, that makes sense.
Not that, okay, so, and some people do that,
No.
it's 5, so it's
Yeah,
just using that instead of.
Yes, you typed it in wrong, and therefore.
Alright, so for part B instead, I just have 0.5s here. And I get that my n is greater than or equal to what? 18 what? Which is what we expected. It's a little bit bigger. More conservative, it's saying sample more people. Questions?